Why is the theory of evolution important and relevant for Christians and for people today?
Well, I want to start by giving you a quote from Charles Darwin himself. He wrote this in a letter to a friend of his in 1873. And just to clarify, he's mentioning somebody named Lyell, which was a friend of his named Charles Lyell, who was an evolutionary geologist. And here's what Darwin wrote. He said, quote, Lyell is most firmly convinced that he's shaken faith in the deluge, meaning the biblical flood, far more efficiently by never having said a word against the Bible than if he'd acted otherwise. I have read lately Morley's Life of Voltaire, and he insisted direct attacks on Christianity, even when written with the wonderful force and vigor of Voltaire, produce little permanent effect. Real good seems to follow only the slow and silent side attacks. End quote, Charles Darwin. So he himself is saying that it's a wonderful thing to attack Christianity, but in Victorian England, you couldn't do that. You couldn't make a frontal assault on Christianity. So what he did was he introduced what he called a silent side attack. He simply introduces a scientific hypothesis, which claims that men were not created by God, but science has somehow shown that we all, evolved from fish and through natural selection, as he would call it, over time. And without saying a word against the Bible, he let people develop doubts all on their own. Now, this is a very tricky maneuver because the public in the 19th century developed a lot of trust in science. They came up with a lot of things like, they came up with the steamship, they came up with the telegraph, they laid the transatlantic cable. Soon they'd be coming up with telephones and electricity. And so the public put a lot of faith in science, but the people at the top, those we might refer to as a deep state, realized that they could use bad science to trick the public. Actually, we see that today with technocracy, with all this talk of transhumanism, digital IDs, these compulsory vaccines that many of us, myself included, even though I'm a registered nurse for 45 years, I don't want the COVID vaccine being mandated for me. So Darwinism is like an early stage of technocracy. But in terms of Christianity, it really had a profound effect on many people's faith. And I think I should just clarify that I've met Christians who have said, hey, I was taught evolution. It didn't affect my faith at all. Or, I believe in the Bible and evolution. What's wrong with that? Well, and there are a lot of people who do say that. But actually, if you look at the book of Genesis and the story of creation, as Adam and Eve being created by God in the Garden of Eden, that's quite different from Darwin's theory that we evolved from apes and before that from fish over billions of years. Very different. And I'm going to give you some examples of people who had their faith destroyed by Darwinism. And, I think a good starting point is actually to quote Julian Huxley. He was the brother of Aldous Huxley, who you might know wrote a book called Brave New World. And he was the grandson of Thomas Huxley, who was a great friend of Charles Darwin. And he said this, quote, Darwinism removed the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion, end quote. In other words, you're not even rational if you believe in God instead of Darwin's theory. But now let me give you some examples of people who lost their faith because of it. There was a kid in the Boy Scouts a few years ago named Daryl Lambert, and he was threatened with expulsion from the Boy Scouts because he said he didn't believe in God. And the Boy Scouts, at least at that time, you had to say you believed in God. Direct quote is what he said to the press: "I'm an atheist. I believe in evolution." End quote. Another quote. Now I'm going to give you some prominent people. Now this is from E.O. Wilson, famous biologist from Harvard University. He said, quote, as were many persons from Alabama, I was a born-again Christian. When I was 15, I entered the Southern Baptist Church with great fervor and interest in the fundamentalist religion. I left at 17 when I got to the University of Alabama and heard about evolutionary theory, end quote. Now, Andrew Carnegie, the famous steel magnate, wrote this in his autobiography, quote, when I, along with 3 or 4 of my boon companions, was in this stage of doubt about theology, including the supernatural, and indeed the whole scheme of salvation, I came fortunately upon Darwin's works. I remember that light came as a flood, and all was clear. Not only had I gotten rid of theology and the supernatural, I'd found the truth of evolution. I'll give you one more quote. I think this is significant. This is from a biography of Joseph Stalin, who you probably know was the dictator of the Soviet Union, who murdered millions of people. This book was published in Moscow in 1940. It's called Landmarks in the Life of Stalin. And here's what it says, quote, at a very early age, while still a pupil in the ecclesiastical school, or a religious school, right? Comrade Stalin developed a critical mind and revolutionary sentiments. He began to read Darwin and became an atheist. Ziegler Jidzi, a boyhood friend of Stalin's, relates, I began to speak of God. Joseph heard me out, and after a moment's silence said, they're fooling us. There is no God. I was astonished at these words. I'd never heard anything like it before. How can you say such things, so? I exclaimed. I will lend you a book to read. It will show you that the world and all living things are quite different from what you imagine. And all this talk about God is sheer nonsense, Joseph said. What book is that? I inquired. Darwin, you must read it. Joseph impressed upon me, end quote. Landmarks in the Life of Stalin. Now, one final example is myself. I did not grow up in a Christian home. We were not a religious family. We were not churchgoers. But I knew about the story of Adam and Eve, and I'd heard about it. And I didn't have any particular bias against it until the 6th grade in Lexington, Massachusetts, Parker Elementary School. My teacher, Mr. Horowitz, was teaching evolution. A little classmate raised her hand and said, Mr. Horowitz, that's not what the Bible says. And he looked at the girl with pity in his eyes and he said, I'm sorry, dear, but science has proven that the Bible is wrong. And my classmates piped up. They said, yeah, the Bible's a bunch of malarkey. Didn't you know that? So who am I going to believe, my little dorky Christian classmate or my teacher and all my other classmates? Well, I fell in with the majority, and I didn't know it at the time, but this is, for me, was the first step in my journey towards becoming an atheist. I was just 12 at the time. This is the first step towards becoming an atheist. And I thought, the Bible, that's been proven to be just an old myth. So evolution is quite significant for Christians to know about, and it's helpful to know that there's actually quite a few scientific arguments against it.
So basically, as the Bible produces Christians and believers, the theory of evolution has produced unbelievers repeatedly and atheists.